Thank you, Aspen, for coming to talk to us about your new book, Philosophy and Dissidence in Cold War Europe. What led you to the writing of this book?
This book has been a long-term project over the course of many different years and different combinations of research. It began really as a project that wanted to look at the historical aspects of what happened in 1989 and connect those to the intellectual background of the participants who went on to be politicians in the new states after 1989. That more historical project morphed into a question about how political theory itself might learn from and be informed by some of the political practices of dissidents that happened in Cold War Europe, and especially turning to the question of the writings of the dissidents themselves who turned into politicians. The writings as texts, for me, were great examples of political theory and how to think through the relationship between the individual and the state. And I didn't feel like there was a conversation out there in academia within political theory about the value of these texts as pieces of political thinking. So I wanted to use the book to elaborate those ideas, to help the audience see that there was a way to put these texts into conversations with political theory more generally, and then to go from there and really to try to say something about the phenomenon of dissidence and how it is that we can understand this in the context of lots more different cases happening around the world, whether it be the Arab Spring or Occupy Wall Street or these other movements. The last chapter really turns to the general questions of what it is to think like a dissident and how to think about politics in a way that channels some of the interesting thoughts and insights of the dissidents from Eastern Europe.
Among the various figures that appear in the book, Vaclav Havel seems to me to loom the largest. What was it about Havel that drew you to him?
There was a lot about Havel that was very compelling for me, I think, from a very young age, really, from the time I was an undergraduate and reading some of his speeches and some of his early essays, Politics and Conscience, Power of the Powerless. These were pieces for me that really showed a different kind of political thinking than I had been used to throughout both my life and my other readings and my academic study. So that the mode of politics at stake is one where there is a possibility of both sort of deep democratic participation, but also a recognition that politics and life overlap in an existential way, in a fascinating combination that definitely does not get spoken of in American politics very often. And I think given the totalitarian societies and the context in which he was writing, there was really a freshness to it, even given the censorship under which he wrote, even given the very repressed circumstances. There was a fresh thinking that could apply across political spectrums from authoritarian states, and even a very interesting critique of democracy is there within his work that I think applies both to European and American context and to the overlap of capitalism and democracy and some of those conundrums that are produced. So Havel became a central intellectual inspiration for me. I still teach Havel's text in my classes as well, and that the springboard for the book came from looking at what he had to offer and then also zooming out to the larger context of the other countries of Eastern Europe and the people he was in conversation with, both philosophically and politically, going into the movements in 1989 and out from Charter 77 and those other incidents.
History and political theory are important to your analysis, but philosophy plays a special role, that of deepening your analysis of the dissident. Would you agree?
Yes, ultimately I come out at the place that dissidence is a philosophical moment, that it's one where you really have to look inside about how you think, and that way of thinking can be influenced by lots of different philosophical schools. So I try to show that within the book of where modes of thinking can then ultimately change your way of acting. But the philosophy really becomes important because if you are going to change the way you think and the way you act, you need to understand the structures of how you think, and that the philosophical reading texts of dissidents, some of which aren't themselves very philosophical, but to read them philosophically then gives you a kind of leverage about modes of thinking that then also sort of shows philosophy can be in itself in conversation with politics and also in conversation with the thoughts inside your head, that these thoughts are what drive people to become dissidents. These thoughts are what sort of frame their relations of meaning and political action, and then from there, that's eventually what turns into politics. Are these ways of thinking? So, in that sense, the philosophy, I think, needs to be more recognized as the base of different kind of political frameworks, and so that was part of the structure and inspiration for the book.
Of all the philosophical currents in modern European thought, why did you focus on existentialism?
The gaps, I think, in political theory led me to turn in an existentialist way. The core of that question is why it is that you go from being a passive participant and a passive sort of recipient of politics, especially in an authoritarian society, to having a moment which I think philosophically is somewhat like turning around in Plato's cave, right? You have a kind of moment where you realize that the position you're in is false, that there's something there's something restraining about it, and that you discover that you have a problem with that kind of restraint. You see the illusions that are being fed to you by the political system, so to speak, to stay on the Plato metaphor. And the moment of turning around is one that really makes you have to ask the deep questions about who you are as a human being and what your relationship is to the world as a human being. And the existentialist train of thought really is one where you have to believe that you, in a sense, are a creator and a maker of your world, right? That you have to create your existence to be an existentialist. And so that creative aspect of acting out into the world existentially and sort of going forward and believing that that is part of who you are, that kind of action, I think has really just not been out there in political theory as a conversation piece and as a sort of philosophical route. And so that this project is also trying to introduce those existentialist questions in order to explain why it is that people go from being very passive in one moment to being very active in response to stimuli or response to situations that don't seem all that different, but there are these transformations that happen really within people and within the way they think about things to go forward.
The dissident movements you describe had a variety of players: priests, rock musicians, poets, playwrights, novelists. Can you say something about how they embodied dissidence?
I think the thread that was connecting the various disparate actors, from the rock musician to the philosopher to the poet, so to speak, was really a relationship to the modes of power that were existing in authoritarian societies, particularly the communist societies, and then a willingness, a way of understanding that power, but then also a willingness to confront it and to deconstruct it in a way. So the way a rock musician does that is, of course, very different than the way a philosopher does that, but there's a recognition in both cases that the established structures of thinking and acting and those structures that make up the politics need to be delegitimated through an alternate discourse, through something that speaks out against it, and through that then challenges all the everyday notions that people accept automatically. And so that thread, I think, connected these very, very different characters, and that's again sort of how the book tries to build a kind of definition of dissidence as well at the end.
In your closing paragraph, you say, coming to know the texts of dissidents is a way of coming to know the human condition. Could you expand on that? Unpack for us what you mean by it?
Well, of course, the human condition is a phrase I take from Hannah Arendt. That's, I think, well known within the corpus of political theory. There's an implicit reference there. What I think the human condition then, what I think can be said about the human condition, expanding from Arendt's idea, is that dissidence can happen anywhere, I think, is the claim at the end. And I tell my students this when I teach a course called Philosophies of Dissidence. Part of the structure of that course is to say there are power systems, there are institutions, there are modes of thinking, there are traditions and social practices that you do automatically, right? Any student does them, any adult does them. In response to these structures of power, you actually have choices. And so that the human condition idea is trying to say that the text of Dissidence can give you a vision of the human condition where you're not stuck, right? Where you're not trapped in these institutions and these structures of power, and that there are ways to work around them, to think around them, to try to in a sense, change your own relationship to them by the way you think, so that this, I think, represents a place for your humanness to reside that gives you, in a sense, more options and more choices, and makes the world look less rigid and less inflexible and less and makes you feel like you're less of a victim of that world, that you're actually a participant of it, and that you can engage with it in a way that you might not have thought you could before kind of embodying this particular stance and going in that direction of thinking.
As you mentioned before, your concluding chapter is titled As If I Were a Dissident, A Guide to Thinking and Acting. How can the lives of dissidents be guides for us?
I think my answer to that is similar to the last question. I think the guide is one where what I want the reader to take away is a series of questions. I don't pretend that these dissidents have all the answers to all political or philosophical problems. I don't think that's sort of why you read them for the final solution in any sense. There is no final solution to these problems. But what I want the reader to take away is that there is a series of questions that you can ask yourself in order to dissect the world around you, in order to understand how you got where you are, why you're there, and what sort of world you were born into by the sort of accidents of birth. That there is a series of questions where you can ask those of yourself, of other people, and then be able to see your own position in a new light, I think.
What's up next for you? Any projects you're working on?
Yes, I've got a book going on right now that really sort of flows right out of the end of this one. In the last chapter of this book, I take up the philosopher Jan Patočka, who was an inspiration for Vaclav Havel's thinking in many regards. He was a phenomenologist. He had studied under Husserl and Heidegger. And so what I'm doing with the next book is to sort of zero in and focus on his work in particular with a similar set of questions, really focusing on the conundrum of his philosophy in relationship to how late in his life he came out as a political figure with Charter 77, with Vaclav Havel, and did that late in his life. He wasn't always a political activist, but I'm trying to dig into the relationships between his way of thinking, so to speak, as a dissident, and what that had to do with his corpus of earlier works, of his earlier philosophy. So he's a fascinating figure who, quite unfortunately, died under police interrogation shortly after Charter 77 was released. So he became a martyr figure as well, and his works have slowly sort of made their way out from the underground Samstadt collections into more formal texts. He wasn't able to write and publish in a traditional philosophical way for all of his life. So going back into some of those texts and looking at them, and then in a sense asking the same kind of questions, but in more detail and more depth, focused on one philosopher, is the next project. So that's well underway and hopefully done soon.
Well, thank you for coming to talk to us. The book's topic seems so relevant.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure to talk about it and to share it with you.